I learned there's a price for trusting the wrong family the night I signed papers I didn't fully read. It was after a 12-hour shift, my uniform still smelled like antiseptic, and the courthouse clock said 6:47 p.m. My mother-in-law sat across from me, sliding a blue folder closer, saying she was just helping. I noticed her hands were shaking, but her coffee cup wasn't. 3 days later, my husband's insurance disappeared. And that was when I realized everything I believed about loyalty was about to fall apart. I learned there's a price for trusting the wrong family the night I signed papers I didn't fully read. It was after a 12-hour shift on a wet Tuesday in late May. The kind of night where the rain sticks to your sleeves and your boots leave dark prints across every floor. I still had my uniform on. The fabric smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. My radio was dead. My phone battery was at 9%, and the digital clock above the courthouse doors said 6:47 p.m. I remember that number because it felt too early for everything that followed. I wasn't supposed to be there. I had planned to go straight home, heat up leftover soup, and sleep until my next shift. But Marla, my mother-in-law, had called while I was restocking the ambulance. She said there was one small thing we needed to sign before the long weekend. She said it would be easier if we did it together, face to face. She said it was about paperwork the insurance company needed to move things along. That phrase, move things along, meant something different to her than it ever did to me. We sat at a plastic table under buzzing fluorescent lights. The chairs were bolted to the floor. A security guard walked past every few minutes, his keys clinking softly at his hip. Marla placed a blue folder between us. She slid it closer with 2 fingers, careful not to wrinkle the edges. "This just makes things cleaner," she said. "You don't want loose ends." I nodded because that's what I had been doing for weeks, nodding, agreeing, letting other people decide what was cleaner, easier, more appropriate. I picked up the pen. It was chained to the table with a thin metal cord. The ink skipped on the first line, then smoothed out. The papers were warm, like they'd been sitting in her car. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the air smelled faintly like bleach and old paper. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang until it stopped. Marla talked while I signed. She talked about the weather, about traffic on the Narrows Bridge, about how busy the grocery stores get before Memorial Day. She didn't rush me. She didn't raise her voice. She never does. Her words come out even and soft, like she's reading instructions printed on the back of a box. I noticed her hands were shaking, just slightly. Her coffee cup, sitting to her right, was perfectly still. I told myself I was tired. I told myself that grief does strange things to your focus. I told myself that families help each other when someone dies, and that this, whatever this was part of that help. I signed where the sticky notes pointed, initialed the corners, handed the pen back. Marla smiled. It didn't reach her eyes, but I didn't think about that until later. 3 days after that, my husband's insurance disappeared. Not slowly, not with a warning. It was just gone. I found out on a Friday morning, the start of Memorial Day weekend. I was standing in my kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, pouring cereal into a chipped bowl. The milk expired that day. I remember checking the date twice, like that detail mattered. My phone buzzed on the counter. An email notification, then another. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed the insurance company's name. The woman on the line spoke carefully, like she was choosing each word from a list she'd been trained to use. She asked me to confirm my address. She asked for my date of birth. She asked if I was sitting down. She said there had been a change to the policy. I told her there must be a mistake. I told her my husband had named me as the beneficiary years ago, back when we still argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash. She said she understood. She said the change had been processed 2 days after the funeral. She said it had been signed and notarized. I asked her to repeat the date. She did. I stood there, staring at the cereal floating in milk, and felt something shift inside my chest, not sharp, not loud, just a slow tilt, like the floor moving under your feet when you don't expect it. She offered to email me the paperwork. When it came through, the file name ended in my last name. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I thanked her and hung up. I rinsed the bowl, set it upside down in the rack, and leaned my forehead against the cabinet door until the wood felt cool. Later that afternoon, a white envelope arrived in my mailbox. It had my name printed in neat black letters. Inside was a notice from a credit card company I'd never used, welcoming me and reminding me of my first payment due date. The amount was more than my rent. I checked the return address. It was from Gig Harbor. Marla lives in Gig Harbor. I sat on the steps outside my apartment with the envelope in my lap and watched my neighbor's dog chase a tennis ball across the parking lot. Someone was grilling down the block. The air smelled like charcoal and hot dogs. A pickup truck drove past with a folded flag visible through the back window. It was the kind of afternoon people post photos of. I called Marla. It rang 4 times before she answered. "Oh, honey," she said, before I could speak. "I was just thinking about you." I told her what the insurance company said. I told her about the letter. There was a pause, just long enough to notice. Then she sighed. "You're still very emotional," she said. "This isn't the time to be talking about money. We need to honor Ethan's memory." She said his name like it was a fragile thing that might crack if handled the wrong way. I asked her if she'd been to my mailbox. Another pause. "You're exhausted," she said. "Why don't you rest?" She hung up before I could say anything else. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on my couch with the lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of fireworks someone was testing early. My phone sat on the coffee table, face down. I kept thinking about the blue folder. The way she'd pushed it toward me. The way the paper felt warm. At 2:13 a.m. I remembered a voicemail Ethan had left me months earlier, back when he'd been away for training. I scrolled through old messages until I found it. His voice was grainy, rushed. "If anything ever happens," he'd said, "don't let Mom handle the insurance. Promise me." I hadn't thought about that message since the day he sent it. I hadn't needed to. Now I played it again, and then again, until the words settled into a shape I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I opened my laptop and pulled my credit report. There were accounts I didn't recognize, inquiries I hadn't authorized, addresses that weren't mine. I created a new folder on my desktop and named it 2024. Inside that, I made another folder. Documents. I didn't call anyone, I didn't post anything, I didn't drive to Gig Harbor and demand answers. I did what my job has taught me to do when everything feels out of control. I slowed down. I wrote dates on a legal pad. I saved emails, I took photos of envelopes. I listened to the voicemail one more time and saved a copy to a flash drive. At some point that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, my brother-in-law. "You need to stop causing problems." I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone face down again. By Sunday evening, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever I thought loyalty meant, whatever I believed about family stepping in when you're at your weakest, was about to be tested in ways I hadn't imagined. And the cost wasn't going to be small. Before I can explain how the paperwork happened, I have to explain the family it came from. Marla Baines has lived in Gig Harbor for as long as I've known her, in a pale gray house at the end of a cul-de-sac, where the lawns are edged so clean they look drawn on. Her windows always shine. The porch light comes on at exactly the same time every evening. Neighbors wave when they drive by, not because they know her well, but because she has that kind of presence, the kind that makes people assume she's respectable before she ever opens her mouth. She likes to say she believes in order. The first time I met her, she shook my hand with both of hers and held it just a second too long. She looked me up and down, not in a rude way, but in a thorough one, like she was taking inventory. Then she smiled and told me she was glad Ethan had finally found someone steady. At the time, I took it as a compliment. Ethan and I had been dating for a year by then. He was in the National Guard, working construction when he wasn't drilling, always tired, always kind. We met the way people in Tacoma often do, through mutual friends, over cheap beer, on a night neither of us planned to stay out late. He liked that I was a paramedic. Said it made him feel safe knowing someone knew what to do when things went wrong. Marla liked that I had a job that looked good on paper. She didn't love the hours, or the fact that I sometimes missed Sunday dinners, but she never said that directly. Instead, she'd comment on how demanding my work must be, how it was a shame I couldn't have something more flexible now that I was part of a family. Her husband, Ron, had died years before I met Ethan. A heart attack in the garage, sudden, tragic, endlessly referenced. His absence hovered over everything. The photos on the wall, the way Marla still introduced herself as a widow, the way every decision came back to what Ron would have wanted. Tyler, Ethan's younger brother, still lived nearby. He bounced between ideas the way some people bounce between channels: real estate, crypto, landscaping, an app he was always about to launch. Marla called him entrepreneurial. Ethan called him lost, but always with a laugh, like that softened it. Family dinners at Marla's house followed a script: pot roast or chicken, green beans cooked soft, bread warmed in the oven. We sat at the same places every time. Marla asked Ethan about work, nodded at his answers, then turned to Tyler to ask what he was building now. When she asked me about my job, it was usually to tell someone else how proud she was that I help people in emergencies. It was pride at a distance. Pride that didn't require listening. When Ethan and I got married, Marla insisted on handling most of the arrangements. She said she had experience, that weddings were stressful, that I already worked too much. I let her, because at the time, I thought letting someone help was the same as trusting them. I didn't notice the small things then. Or maybe I did and told myself they didn't matter. Like how she always kept copies of our documents, our marriage certificate, Ethan's service records, insurance forms in a thick blue binder she carried everywhere. Like how she asked me to sign things just in case, always presenting the pen already uncapped. Like how she corrected me when I talked about plans, gently steering conversations back to what she thought was more practical. She just likes to be prepared, Ethan would say. That's how she copes. End quote. After Ethan died, preparation became her language of grief. She showed up the morning after the accident with coffee and bagels and a legal pad already filled with notes. She made phone calls while I sat on the couch, still wearing the same sweatshirt I'd slept in. She told me not to worry about anything. She told me she'd take care of the insurance, the benefits, the paperwork I wouldn't want to look at. You shouldn't have to think about that right now, she said. That's what family is for. People kept saying that word family like it explained everything. In the days that followed, I moved through my life like someone underwater. I went back to work because being on shift was easier than being alone. I followed protocols, lifted stretchers, spoke in calm, even tones while my chest felt hollow. When I came home, there were casseroles on my counter and messages on my phone I didn't return. Marla called every morning at 9. If I didn't answer, she left a voicemail. If I did answer, she reminded me to drink water, to eat, to rest. She asked if I'd had a chance to look at the paperwork yet. It's not urgent, she'd say, but it's better not to let things pile up. By the time she asked me to meet her at the courthouse, it felt almost routine. Another task. Another thing to check off so the world could keep moving. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been there. Grief doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like compliance. When I think back now, there were signs I ignored because acknowledging them would have meant slowing down, asking questions, pushing back, and I didn't have the energy for any of that. Like the way Tyler started texting me late at night, asking vague questions about finances. Like the way Marla corrected the insurance agent when he asked me something directly. Like the way conversations stopped when I walked into a room. After the call from the insurance company, those moments rearranged themselves in my mind, lining up into something I could no longer dismiss. I drove to Gig Harbor that Sunday evening. I told myself I just needed clarity. I parked across the street from Marla's house and sat in my car, engine off, watching the porch light click on automatically as the sky darkened. Through the front window, I could see the dining table. The blue binder sat at one end, thick and familiar. I didn't go inside. Instead, I drove home and opened my laptop again. I searched my email for every message from the insurance company. I pulled up the policy documents Ethan and I had signed years earlier. I compared the signatures, the dates, the addresses. There were small differences. A middle initial where there hadn't been one before. A phone number I didn't recognize. An email address that wasn't mine. They were details most people wouldn't notice. I notice details for a living. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Tyler. Mom's just trying to help. Don't make this ugly. I set the phone down and stared at the wall until the words stopped echoing in my head. Ugly, to him, meant asking questions. Ugly meant not playing the role they expected. Ugly meant refusing to be quiet. That was when I understood something that hadn't been clear before. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't even greed in the simple sense. It was control. And whatever I had signed in that courthouse, whatever they had already taken or were planning to take next, was only possible because they believed I wouldn't fight back. They believed grief had made me smaller. They were wrong. I didn't know yet how this would end. I didn't know what it would cost, or who I would lose in the process. But as I sat there, alone in my apartment, listening to the distant sound of traffic on the highway, one thing became clear. The story they were telling about me, the confused widow, the emotional outsider, the problem that needed managing was about to collapse. And when it did, nothing in that family would look the same again. The weeks after that realization didn't explode the way people expect moments like that to. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. No shouting matches, no slammed doors, no confession that made everything suddenly clear. What happened instead was smaller, quieter. It started with dinners. Marla resumed Sunday dinners as if nothing had changed. She texted me the same message every week: roast is on at 5, like it was an obligation written into law. The first time I went back, I told myself it was easier to show up than to explain why I wouldn't. Her house smelled the same as always, lemon cleaner and something floral I couldn't identify. The table was set exactly the way it always was, plates warmed in the oven, water glasses already filled. My seat was still there, but something about it had shifted. I noticed it when Tyler arrived late and Marla waved him into the chair beside her, the one Ethan used to sit in. She didn't ask. She didn't acknowledge the change. She just slid my place, setting down one spot, closer to the end of the table. No one commented. I ate quietly, answering questions with short sentences. When I talked about work, Marla nodded without looking at me, already reaching for more gravy. When I stopped talking, the conversation didn't pause. It just moved on without me. After dinner, I offered to help clean up out of habit. Marla hesitated, then handed me a stack of plates. "You don't have to," she said. "You've been through enough." I washed them anyway. At the sink, I could hear Marla and Tyler talking in low voices behind me. When I turned, they stopped. That became the pattern. Invitations that came late. Conversations that happened just out of reach. Decisions made and explained afterward, if they were explained at all. Marla started referring to things as family matters when I asked questions. She said it gently, like she was sparing me something. "Insurance stuff is complicated," she told me once, folding a napkin carefully in her lap. "You wouldn't want to deal with that on top of everything else." I asked her what she meant by everything else. She smiled. "Your emotions." Tyler laughed, quick and sharp, then stopped when Marla glanced at him. At work, I functioned the way I always did. I showed up early. I checked my gear. I ran calls. I listened to people at their worst moments and spoke to them in a voice that steadied their breathing. I knew how to stay calm in chaos. I knew how to compartmentalize. What I didn't know, yet, was how much of that skill my husband's family had been counting on. The first real sign came in the mail. Another envelope arrived, this one thicker, addressed to me but with an unfamiliar return address. Inside was a notice from a utility company thanking me for opening a new account. The service address was in Gig Harbor. I stared at the page for a long time, then checked the date. It had been opened the same week I signed the papers at the courthouse. I drove to the address listed. It was a small rental house, empty, with a for lease sign staked into the lawn. No lights, no car, just a locked door and a mailbox that looked recently emptied. On the drive back, my phone rang. "Marla. I was just thinking about you," she said, like she always did. I told her about the letter. There was a pause, longer than before. "Well," she said slowly, "these companies make mistakes all the time." I asked her if Tyler had rented a place recently. Another pause. "He's been exploring options," she said. "You know how he is." She changed the subject after that, asked if I was eating enough, if I'd considered taking time off work. When we hung up, I realized she hadn't actually denied anything. At the next dinner, I noticed something else. The blue binder was no longer on the dining table. Instead, it sat on a shelf in the living room, partially hidden behind a framed photo of Ethan in uniform. The spine faced inward. The cover was closed. I didn't touch it. I didn't mention it. I just noted where it was. Later, when Marla stepped into the kitchen to answer a call, Tyler leaned back in his chair and looked at me like he'd been waiting. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I asked him what he meant. "You're still acting like you're one of us," he said, shrugging. "That's not really the situation anymore." The words landed heavier than I expected. "What situation is that?" I asked. He glanced toward the kitchen. "Mom's just trying to protect what's left of the family." I thought about Ethan, about the voicemail I'd saved, about the insurance policy that no longer had my name on it. "What about protecting me?" I asked. Tyler smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't careless. It was calculated. "That's not really her job," he said. After that, the micro-humiliations came faster. Marla asked Tyler to handle financial discussions while I was in the room, then summarized them for me afterward, inaccurately. She told people at church that I was taking space, even when I hadn't been invited. She offered condolences on my behalf, like she spoke for me now. At one gathering, a woman I barely knew touched my arm and said, "Marla says you're not ready to deal with adult responsibilities yet." I didn't correct her. That was the most unsettling part. How easily my silence was interpreted as agreement. How quickly my absence became a story they told without me. One afternoon, I stopped by Marla's house unannounced to drop off a casserole someone at work had made. Her car was in the driveway. The doorbell camera blinked when I stepped onto the porch. No one answered. Through the window, I could see the dining table. The blue binder was back, open this time. Papers spread around it. Tyler stood beside it. Phone pressed to his ear. I left the casserole on the porch and walked back to my car. That night, I added another section to my folder on the laptop. Timeline. I wrote down dates, times, addresses. I cross-referenced mail, phone records, emails. I saved screenshots, PDFs, audio files. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Grief had taught me something important. People underestimate quiet endurance. They mistake it for weakness. At the end of June, Marla invited me to a church fundraiser. She said it would be good for me to get out. When I arrived, she greeted me with a hug that lasted just long enough for people to notice. "There she is," she said loudly. "We're so proud of how strong she's being." End quote. During the event, she introduced Tyler as handling family finances now, and introduced me as taking time to heal. Each phrase landed like a label. I stood by the refreshment table, holding a paper cup of lemonade, listening to people talk around me. No one asked me questions. They just nodded sympathetically, as if my story had already been explained to them. On the way home, I pulled over and turned off the engine. I sat there in the quiet, hands on the steering wheel, and let the weight of it settle. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't kindness gone wrong. It was a slow, deliberate narrowing of space. A way of making me smaller without ever touching me. And in that moment, something inside me hardened, not into anger, but into resolve. If they wanted me quiet, I would be quiet. If they wanted me small, I would disappear. Not because I was afraid, but because I was paying attention. And somewhere between the blue binder, the missing mail, and the stories being told in rooms I no longer entered, I understood that whatever came next wouldn't be about proving them wrong. It would be about surviving what they never expected me to see. The accident itself didn't feel real until weeks later, when the adrenaline wore off and the paperwork began to stack up. At first, everything about Ethan's death existed in fragments. A phone call that came too early in the morning. A trooper's voice, steady and practiced, explaining where my car was parked and how fast the rain had been coming down. A stretch of highway I'd driven 100 times, now reduced to mile markers and skid marks. People assume that the moment someone dies, the world stops. It doesn't. It speeds up. Within 48 hours, there were forms to sign, appointments to keep, decisions to make that felt wildly inappropriate so close to loss. Marla arrived with a legal pad already filled out. She knew the names of offices, the order of steps. She spoke to people on the phone using Ethan's full name, like that made everything more official. I followed her lead because I didn't know how not to. The funeral came together quickly. A weekday service, neat and contained, exactly the way Marla liked things. Flags folded with military precision. A slideshow of photos I'd never seen before: Ethan at church picnics, Ethan with Tyler on fishing trips, Ethan smiling beside Marla at events I hadn't attended. I noticed my absence more than once, but I told myself that grief distorts memory. After the service, people lined up to hug Marla. They told her how strong she was, how well she was holding up. When they reached me, their expressions shifted, softened, as if they were approaching something fragile. "I'm so sorry," they said, again and again. Marla stood close, her hand resting lightly on my back, steering conversations, answering questions for me when I hesitated. When someone asked about insurance or benefits, she stepped in smoothly. "We're taking care of that," she said. "I don't want her worrying about paperwork right now." No one argued. In the days that followed, she drove me to appointments. She brought meals I didn't eat. She called my employer to explain why I'd be out for a few days longer than planned. When I returned to work, she reminded me to take it slow. "You don't have to be brave," she said, squeezing my hand. "Let us handle things." That phrase "let us" started to replace you in her vocabulary. When the insurance company first sent forms to my email, Marla asked me to forward them to her, just in case. She said she'd dealt with this kind of thing after Ron died. She said companies try to rush widows into mistakes. I believed her. I didn't notice when replies stopped coming to my inbox and started going to hers instead. I didn't question why she insisted on keeping physical copies of everything. I didn't wonder how she always seemed to know which documents were needed next. Grief makes you outsource your judgment. The courthouse meeting happened during that window, when my world was still soft around the edges, when I hadn't yet realized how carefully that softness was being used against me. After the insurance call, after the letters arrived, I replayed those early days in my head, looking for a moment where I could have stopped it, a question I should have asked, a pause I should have taken. There was one memory that kept coming back. It was the afternoon after the funeral, when Marla suggested we sit down together and organize. She spread documents across her dining table, smoothing each page as she laid it out. Policies, bank statements, forms with highlighted sections. She moved with confidence, like this was familiar terrain. "I'll keep everything together," she said, tapping the blue binder. "That way nothing gets lost." At the time, that felt comforting. Now, I understood what it really meant. The more I looked, the more I saw how quickly she'd stepped into a role that hadn't been offered, how seamlessly she'd placed herself between me and every institution that mattered: insurance, banks, even friends. When people asked how I was doing, she answered for me. When I didn't respond to messages, she told them I needed space. When mail went missing from my apartment, she suggested I forward it to her house, temporarily. End quote. By the time I realized what was happening, the lines were already blurred. The first time I tried to pull them back into focus was at the insurance office. I drove there alone, early one morning, before my shift. The parking lot was mostly empty. Inside, the waiting room smelled like carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. A television mounted on the wall played a muted morning show. I gave the receptionist my name and explained why I was there. She typed, nodded, then frowned slightly at her screen. "Oh," she said, "we've been working with your mother." "My mother?" I asked. She corrected herself. "Your mother-in-law. She's listed as your contact." I asked how that had happened. She pointed to a form on the screen. Authorization was signed. The date matched the courthouse visit. I felt that slow tilt again, the sensation of the ground shifting just enough to throw you off balance. "Can I see it?" I asked. She hesitated, then printed a copy and slid it across the counter. My name was there. My signature, close enough to be believable if you weren't looking for differences. A phone number I didn't recognize. An email address that wasn't mine. I thanked her, folded the paper, and walked back to my car without feeling my feet touch the ground. On the drive home, I passed the courthouse. The digital clock above the doors flashed 6:47, even though it was morning. It must have been stuck. I pulled over and sat there for a moment, watching people go in and out, couples, lawyers, a man in a suit arguing quietly into his phone. That was when I understood something important. This wasn't a single bad decision. It wasn't one form, or one signature, or one moment of distraction. It was a window. A narrow window that opened when Ethan died, when my defenses were down, when everyone assumed I needed managing instead of agency, and Marla had stepped through it without hesitation. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing with messages, church friends checking in, Tyler asking if I'd calmed down yet, Marla leaving a voicemail reminding me we had dinner plans. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table and spread the papers out in front of me. I compared signatures, dates, addresses. I lined up envelopes and postmarks. I played Ethan's voicemail again, then wrote down the exact timestamp. The picture forming in front of me was uncomfortable, but it was clear. Whatever happened next had already started long before the insurance disappeared, long before the mail went missing, long before I realized I was being edged out of my own life. This wasn't about money alone. It was about who was allowed to decide what I could handle, who was trusted to speak for me, who benefited when I stayed quiet. And sitting there, alone at that table, I made a choice that felt small but mattered more than anything I'd done since Ethan died. I stopped letting anyone take care of it for me. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped assuming good intentions. Because the truth was simple, even if it was hard to accept. The moment Ethan was gone, the people who claimed to love him had already begun rearranging the world he left behind. And if I didn't step back and watch carefully, they would finish doing it without me ever realizing how much I'd lost. The night before Memorial Day, the city went quiet in a way that only happens before long weekends. Traffic thinned. Porch lights stayed on later. Somewhere down the block, someone set off a single firework that echoed and then disappeared. I had the windows open, letting in cool air that smelled faintly of wet asphalt and cut grass. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop closed, legal pad open, pen resting across the top like a promise I wasn't ready to keep yet. I hadn't written anything new that day. I'd just been staring at the same dates, the same names, as if they might rearrange themselves if I waited long enough. At 9:18 p.m., my phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was a notification from a bank I didn't use. Your statement is ready. I stared at the screen, waiting for the message to correct itself. It didn't. I tapped the notification, half expecting an error page. Instead, I saw a balance, a credit limit, a payment due date. My name was at the top. My address, almost correct but not quite, was underneath it. I stood up so fast the chair scraped across the floor. I walked to the front door and checked the mail slot, even though I already knew there wouldn't be anything there. I checked my phone again, scrolling through emails, through spam, through messages I'd ignored all day. There was another one. And another. One from a utility company, one from a loan servicer. Each one thanked me for opening an account. Each one assumed I knew exactly what they were talking about. I called the first number on the list. The automated system kept thanking me for my patience, reminding me how important my call was. When a person finally answered, she asked me to verify my information. She read my name, my social, an address in Gig Harbor. That's not my address, I said. She paused. That's what we have on file. I asked when the account was opened. She gave me a date. It was the same week I'd signed papers at the courthouse. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from panic, but from something colder, something steadier. This wasn't sloppy. It wasn't rushed. It was coordinated. At 10:02 p.m., another email came in. This one was from the insurance company, not the call center. A direct message from a case manager I hadn't spoken to before. We've attached the beneficiary change confirmation for your records. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I sat there, phone in my hand, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of laughter drifting in from somewhere nearby. Someone was having a barbecue. Someone was celebrating the start of summer. I opened the attachment. The form was clean, official. My name appeared exactly where it should, except it wasn't my name listed as beneficiary anymore. It was Marla's. The change date was 2 days after the funeral. The signature at the bottom looked like mine if you didn't know how I sign when I'm tired, or how I cross my T too low. It was convincing enough to pass at a glance. What caught my eye wasn't the signature. It was the contact information. A phone number I'd never used, an email address I didn't recognize. Both were now listed as mine. I scrolled back up, reading the form again, slower this time. At the bottom was a notary stamp. Clear. Legible. I took a screenshot, then another. Then I saved the PDF to my laptop, my flash drive, and emailed it to myself with a subject line that read only, "Do not forget this." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. Instead, I made coffee. It was late, but sleep wasn't an option anymore. The coffee tasted burnt and thin. I drank it anyway. At 10:37 p.m., I remembered the voicemail again. I hadn't listened to it since the night I saved it, but now I opened my phone and played it out loud, letting Ethan's voice fill the quiet kitchen. "If anything ever happens," he said, rushed, slightly out of breath, "don't let Mom handle the insurance. Promise me." I wrote down the exact time and date of the message. I noted where he was when he sent it. I saved a copy to a second flash drive and labeled it in black marker. At 11:15 p.m., my phone rang. "Marla." I let it ring. She called again, then left a voicemail. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "Tyler told me you've been asking questions again. I think we should talk before things get misunderstood." Misunderstood. I didn't call her back. Instead, I pulled up my credit report again and froze my credit with all 3 bureaus. I set fraud alerts. I changed passwords I hadn't thought about in years. I opened a new email account and started redirecting anything financial there. Each action felt small, almost ordinary. Together, they felt like building a wall one brick at a time. At midnight, another text came in. This one from Tyler. "You're overreacting. Mom's trying to protect you." I stared at the words until they blurred. Protect me from what? At 12:26 a.m., I stepped out onto my balcony and looked down at the parking lot. A car pulled in slowly. Someone laughed. A door slammed. Life went on, indifferent to the way mine had just split in two. That was when the anger finally surfaced, not loud, not explosive, but sharp and focused. They hadn't just taken money. They hadn't just forged paperwork. They had decided, without asking, that I was no longer a person who got to consent. They had rewritten my role from wife to problem, from partner to liability, from adult to someone who needed managing. And they had done it while telling everyone they were helping. I went back inside and opened my laptop again. I added a new folder under 2024 and named it Memorial Day. Inside, I saved every document from that night. I wrote a short summary of what had happened, with timestamps, names, and sources. I didn't know yet who would read it, but I knew someone would. At 1:03 a.m., I finally turned my phone off and lay down on the couch. The room was dark, quiet except for the occasional car passing on the street below. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the blue folder, about the warm papers, about the way Marla's coffee cup hadn't shaken even when her hands did. This wasn't grief making me paranoid. This was a line being crossed. And as the hours ticked closer to dawn, I understood something that settled deep and heavy in my chest. Whatever came next, I wouldn't be able to undo what had already happened. The insurance was gone. The accounts were opened. The story they were telling about me was already circulating. But I could decide how it ended. Not by shouting, not by pleading, but by letting them keep thinking I didn't see it long enough for me to understand exactly how far they were willing to go. Because the night before Memorial Day wasn't just when things went wrong, it was when I stopped being confused. And confusion, I was learning, was the only thing they'd been counting on. By the time Memorial Day morning arrived, I had stopped thinking in terms of feelings and started thinking in terms of sequence. That shift didn't make anything hurt less. It just made the pain quieter, more manageable, like background noise you learn to work through. I brewed another pot of coffee and opened my laptop before the sun came up, the sky outside still gray and undecided. I titled a new document, Timeline V1. At the top, I wrote Ethan's name. Under it, the date of the accident. Under that, everything that followed, one line at a time. The first insurance email. The courthouse meeting. The beneficiary change date. The first credit inquiry. The missing mail. I added times where I had them. Addresses where I could confirm them. I didn't write conclusions. I just wrote facts. At 7:12 a.m., I pulled my credit reports again, slower this time. I cross-checked each account against the timeline. The pattern was unmistakable. Every inquiry, every new account, every change happened within a narrow window days after the funeral, days after Marla started helping. I highlighted that window in yellow. At 8:03 a.m., I logged into USPS Informed Delivery. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now I scrolled back through the images, comparing what was scanned with what had actually reached my mailbox. There were at least 6 pieces of mail that showed up in the system but never made it to my hands. All of them were financial. I took screenshots and saved them with file names that included the date and sender. I didn't trust my memory anymore. I trusted documentation. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed again. A voicemail from Marla, then another, then a text. "Please call me. We need to clear this up." I muted the thread and set the phone face down. Instead, I pulled up the insurance company's website and requested a full audit of the policy. There was a form for that. A small link at the bottom of the page most people probably never clicked. I filled it out carefully, attaching the voicemail from Ethan and the beneficiary change confirmation. At 10:46 a.m., I received an automated response confirming receipt of my request. It wasn't justice, but it was movement. I spent the rest of the morning calling companies whose names appeared on my credit report. Each conversation followed the same rhythm: verification, confusion, assurance that fraud departments existed for situations like mine, instructions to submit affidavits, copies of IDs, proof of address. By noon, my printer was warm to the touch. I stacked the papers neatly on the table, separating them with labeled tabs: credit, insurance, mail, communications. Each section grew thicker as the day went on. Sometime after lunch, there was a knock at my door. I froze, heart jumping before I could stop it. Then I reminded myself that fear didn't get to make decisions anymore. When I opened the door, it was my neighbor, holding a package. "This was in my box," she said. "Must have gotten mixed up." The return address was from a bank. I thanked her, closed the door, and sat down on the floor with the envelope still in my hands. It had been opened, resealed with clear tape. Inside was a debit card with my name on it. I added another line to the timeline. At 2:17 p.m., I finally stepped outside. I needed air. The parking lot was full of cars loaded with coolers and folding chairs. Families were heading to lakes, parks, barbecues. A man across the way struggled to secure a kayak to the roof of his car, laughing as it slipped. No one looked at me. That anonymity felt like relief. When I came back inside, I set up a second email account and forwarded all future financial correspondence there. I changed my mailing address for anything official to a P.O. box near the station. I made a list of passwords to update and worked through them one by one. It was tedious. It was boring. It was also the first time since Ethan died that I felt remotely in control. Late that afternoon, I remembered the doorbell camera. I'd installed it years earlier after a string of car break-ins in the area. I rarely checked it. Now, I logged in and scrolled back through the footage from the past month. Most of it was nothing. Shadows. Neighbors. Delivery drivers. Then I saw it. A figure stepping into frame, moving toward my mailbox. A familiar walk. A baseball cap pulled low. The camera caught his face for just a second as he looked up. Tyler. The timestamp matched one of the missing mail scans. I watched the clip 3 times, my pulse steady, my breathing even. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt confirmation. I saved the video and backed it up in 2 places. At 5:09 p.m., my phone rang again. This time, I answered. It was Marla. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice tight around the edges. "I've been worried sick." I told her I'd been busy. "With what?" she asked. "Paperwork," I said. There was silence on the line, the kind that stretches just long enough to notice. "You don't need to do this alone," she said finally. "You're making things harder than they need to be." "I'm making them clearer," I said. She sighed. "You're upset. That's understandable. But you're starting to accuse people of things. It's fact." "I haven't accused anyone," I said. "I'm just collecting records." Another pause. "Tyler's been under a lot of stress," she said. "We all have." I didn't respond. "I think it would be best if we talked in person," she continued. "As a family." "No," I said. The word felt strange in my mouth. New. Solid. No? She repeated. No, I said again. Not right now. When the call ended, my hands were shaking not from fear, but from the effort of holding my ground. That evening, I added one more section to the folder: video evidence. I labeled the Tyler clip with the date and time and wrote a short note underneath it. Mailbox access without consent. I didn't know yet what I would do with any of this. I didn't know which agency would take it seriously or how long it would take to unwind the damage. What I did know was this. The story they were telling, that I was emotional, unstable, confused, relied on my silence. It relied on my hesitation. It relied on my willingness to let other people define reality for me. Every document I saved, every timestamp I recorded, every decision I made without consulting them, weakened that story just a little more. By the time the sun set and fireworks started popping in the distance, I had built something they hadn't expected: a record. And records, unlike people, don't forget. They don't soften details out of kindness. They don't care who looks respectable at church or who speaks the calmest in a crisis. They only show what happened. And as I shut my laptop and finally let myself rest, I understood that this part, this quiet accumulation of proof, was the most dangerous phase for them. Because once you stop needing permission to see the truth, everything that comes after becomes inevitable. The first thing I did after Memorial Day was disappear. Not in the dramatic sense. I didn't pack a bag or change my name or quit my job. I just stopped being available in the ways they were used to. I stopped answering calls I didn't recognize. I stopped replying to group texts that weren't about something concrete. I stopped explaining myself. At work, nothing changed. I showed up early, checked my rig, ran calls, filled out reports. The radio crackled. Sirens wailed. People bled and panicked and clung to my hands the way they always had. In the ambulance, my world still made sense. Cause and effect. Protocol. Documentation. It was everywhere else that I went quiet. I moved my mail to a P.O. box 2 miles from the station. I told no one except my supervisor because it affected payroll. I changed my phone number and kept the old one active on a spare phone I left turned off in a drawer. I wanted to see what would pile up there without me responding. It piled up fast. Marla left voicemails that grew more strained with each one. At first she sounded concerned, then offended, then wounded. "I don't understand why you're shutting us out," she said in one message. "We're the only family you have left." I saved the voicemail and labeled it with the date. Tyler texted twice from different numbers. The second message was shorter than the first. "You're making Mom look bad." I didn't reply. Instead, I made a list of every account that had been touched and every institution that had interacted with Marla or Tyler on my behalf. I organized it alphabetically, then by date. I added notes in the margins: who I spoke to, what they said, what they promised. I learned quickly which departments took fraud seriously and which treated it like an inconvenience. I learned how often "we'll get back to you" meant "we hope you go away." I learned that persistence mattered more than tone. At night, when I got home from shift, I didn't collapse on the couch the way I had before. I sat at the table and worked through the list, one item at a time. It wasn't fast, it wasn't satisfying, but it was steady. About a week in, a detective from the county fraud unit returned my call. He introduced himself as Alvarez. His voice was neutral, unhurried. He asked me to tell him what happened, starting from the beginning. I told him the facts: the courthouse, the insurance change, the missing mail, the accounts. I didn't speculate. I didn't assign motives. I let the sequence speak for itself. When I finished, there was a pause. "You did the right thing by documenting everything," he said. "Most people wait too long." He asked if I'd be willing to send him what I had. I emailed the folder while we were still on the phone. "Don't confront them," he said before we hung up. "If they think you're confused or overwhelmed, let them. It's too much, Tilly." That advice matched what my instincts had already chosen. So I stayed quiet. When Marla showed up at my apartment one afternoon, I didn't answer the door. I watched through the peephole as she stood there, smoothing her hair, glancing at the camera, knocking again. She left a note taped to the door. The handwriting was careful, rounded. "Please stop punishing us. We're worried about you." I photographed the note, then threw it away. At church, people started asking questions. I knew because two of them reached out directly, asking if I was doing okay and if I wanted company. The concern felt rehearsed, filtered through whatever version of the story Marla had decided to tell that week. I thanked them and declined. Silence, I was learning, made people uncomfortable. It created space they couldn't fill with assumptions as easily as they thought. In the background, things kept moving. The insurance company confirmed they were opening a formal investigation. One credit card issuer closed the fraudulent account and issued a letter acknowledging identity theft. Another asked for more documentation. I sent it the same day. Detective Alvarez called again to confirm receipt of the doorbell footage. "That helps," he said simply. At work, my supervisor pulled me aside one evening after shift change. He asked if everything was okay. He said a woman had called the station asking questions about my schedule. I told him I was dealing with a family matter. He nodded and said if anyone showed up, security would handle it. I appreciated that he didn't ask for details. The hardest part of disappearing wasn't the loneliness. It was the discipline. Every instinct told me to defend myself, to correct the record, to tell my side before someone else told it for me. But every time I imagined doing that, I pictured Marla's calm voice and the way she'd already positioned herself as the reasonable one. I didn't need to be louder than her. I needed to be precise. One evening, as I was filing paperwork into the expanding binder I'd made for myself, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. "Hi," a woman said. "My name is Karen. I'm with the notary office in Gig Harbor. We received a request for our journal related to a document you signed." I played the message twice. That was new. I returned the call the next morning. Karen explained that the insurance company's audit had triggered a request for the notary's log. She said they were required to keep detailed records, names, IDs, dates, locations. "Did you sign anything with us?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "at the courthouse." She paused. "According to our journal, the person who signed presented a photocopy of an ID." My grip tightened on the phone. "That's not allowed," I said. "No," she agreed. "It's not. If you arrested Botter," I wrote down everything she told me, then added it to the timeline. That afternoon, Tyler tried again. This time, he showed up at my work parking lot right after my shift ended. He stood by his car, hands in his pockets, watching as I walked toward mine. "You don't have to do this," he said when I got close enough to hear him. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm leaving work." "You're tearing the family apart," he said. His voice was low, urgent. "Mom's barely sleeping." "Too they?" I looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him. The tension in his jaw. The way his eyes kept flicking to the building behind me. "If you're worried," I said, "you should talk to a lawyer." His face changed, just slightly. "That's not necessary," he said. I got in my car and drove away. That night, I added another note to my file. Unannounced contact at workplace. I didn't feel brave. I felt tired. But it was a clean kind of tired, the kind that comes from effort instead of fear. The more I withdrew, the more they escalated. The more they escalated, the clearer the pattern became. They needed me reactive. They needed me emotional. They needed me to break. Instead, I was becoming something they hadn't planned for. Unavailable, invisible, and fully aware. By the end of that week, I had stopped thinking about what they were saying about me and started thinking about what they might do next. Silence had bought me time. Time had given me clarity. Whatever was coming, I knew this much. They had underestimated how far I was willing to step back. And they had no idea how closely I was watching. Stepping back didn't mean stopping. It meant changing where I put my energy. Once I stopped reacting to Marla and Tyler, there was space for other things to grow into that silence. Ordinary things at first. Work routines, sleep, the steady rhythm of days that didn't revolve around what they might do next. At the station, summer settled in. Doors stayed open between calls. Someone brought in a box fan and aimed it at the coffee pot. We ate at odd hours, talked about nothing important, laughed when we could. I didn't tell anyone what was happening beyond what they needed to know. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted normal. One night, after a call that ran long, I sat on the back step with a cup of water and watched the sky lighten toward dawn. My partner that shift, Mike, sat beside me, boots unlaced, radio turned down low. "You've been quieter lately," he said, not accusing, just noticing. "I'm thinking more," I said. He nodded like that made sense. "Sometimes that's worse. Sometimes it is." Outside of work, my life got smaller in deliberate ways. I stopped driving to Gig Harbor entirely. I avoided the grocery store Marla preferred. I took a different route home, not because I was afraid of running into them, but because I didn't want to be reminded of how easy it would be. Instead, I started spending time in places that had no connection to them at all. The library near the station, a coffee shop that didn't know my name, a stretch of waterfront where the benches faced away from the road. That was where I started reading about identity theft in earnest. Not blogs, official resources, statutes, case summaries. I learned what investigators looked for and what they ignored. I learned how often family members were involved, and how rarely they were held accountable without overwhelming documentation. I underlined that part. Over the next 2 weeks, Detective Alvarez checked in periodically. He didn't promise outcomes. He didn't speculate. He asked clarifying questions and requested additional records as they became relevant. Each time he called, my file grew thicker. The insurance audit advanced to a second stage. A woman from the fraud department called to confirm details about the courthouse meeting. She asked who had arranged it, who had been present, who had suggested the notary. I answered carefully, sticking to facts. "She contacted me," I said. "She said it would make things easier." There was a pause on the line. "That's usually not how beneficiaries initiate changes," the woman said. I wrote that down. Around the same time, one of the credit bureaus sent a formal letter acknowledging that the accounts in question were the result of fraud. It wasn't a resolution, but it was validation in ink and letterhead. I slid the letter into the binder and closed it slowly. For the first time since Ethan died, I felt something like relief. Not because it was over. Because it wasn't. But because the truth was starting to carry weight outside of my own head. One afternoon, as I was leaving the station, I noticed a missed call from an unfamiliar number with a local area code. The voicemail was brief. "Hi, this is Ellen. I live near your mother-in-law. I think I might have something you should see." I called her back immediately. Ellen was cautious but kind. She said she'd seen someone taking mail from my box more than once and hadn't thought much of it until a detective knocked on her door asking questions about a blue sedan that parked nearby on certain days. "I didn't want to get involved," she said. "But this didn't feel right." She emailed me a photo she'd taken from her phone weeks earlier. It was grainy, slightly out of focus, but unmistakable. Tyler, standing near my mailbox, envelope in hand. I forwarded the photo to Detective Alvarez and added another note to the timeline. That night, I sat on my living room floor with everything spread out around me: documents, photos, printed emails, handwritten notes. It looked excessive, almost obsessive, if you didn't know the context. But I did. Each piece told the same story from a slightly different angle. Together, they formed something solid enough to stand on. The next escalation came quietly. I received an email from an attorney representing Marla. The subject line read, "Cease and desist." The message accused me of harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. It warned that further false allegations would result in legal action. It urged me to stop contacting third parties and to return family documents in my possession. I read it once, then again. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded it to Detective Alvarez and to the insurance fraud department, then saved a copy under a new folder, Intimidation. The email didn't scare me the way it might have earlier. It confirmed something I'd already suspected. They were no longer confident. At work, my supervisor let me know that station security had intercepted a call from someone claiming to be a relative, asking about my shifts again. He said they'd been told not to release any information. I thanked him and went back to cleaning equipment. Each attempt to reach me now came through layers of other people, investigators, institutions, witnesses. That distance mattered. It changed the dynamic. It made their words carry consequences instead of just pressure. I started sleeping through the night again. Not every night, but more than before. In quieter moments, I thought about Ethan, about the voicemail, about the way he'd asked me to promise something without explaining why. I wondered how long he'd seen this coming, how many compromises he'd made to keep the peace. I didn't feel angry at him. I felt protective of the version of him that had trusted me with that warning. By early July, Detective Alvarez called to tell me he'd forwarded the case to the prosecutor's office for review. "It doesn't mean charges yet," he said, "but it means they're looking." That was enough. The next day, Marla showed up again, this time at the grocery store I'd started using. I saw her before she saw me. She was standing near the produce section, carefully selecting apples, the blue binder nowhere in sight. For a moment, I considered turning away. Instead, I walked past her. She called my name, sharp enough to draw attention. A few people glanced over. "We need to talk," she said, her smile tight. "This has gone far enough." I stopped and faced her. "I'm not discussing anything without my attorney," I said. Her eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the other shoppers. "You don't have an attorney," she said. "Not yet," I replied. "But you should assume I will." She opened her mouth to say something else, then closed it. I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. I walked away. In the parking lot, my hands were shaking not from fear, but from the release of tension I hadn't realized I was holding. That was when I understood what stepping back had really given me. It wasn't just time or clarity. It was leverage. Every day I stayed quiet. Every moment I refused to be pulled into their version of events shifted the balance further out of their control. They couldn't predict me anymore. They couldn't manage me. They were reacting now, and I wasn't. Whatever came next would happen on a different stage, with different rules. Not the private, suffocating space of family dinners and whispered conversations, but a place where facts mattered more than appearances, where calm carried more weight than charm. And as I gathered my things and headed home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, readiness. If silence gave me leverage, it also gave them room to change tactics. I didn't realize it at first. The shift was subtle, wrapped in concern and familiarity, delivered through people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by questioning it. That was the point. It started with messages from people I barely knew. A woman from church I'd spoken to twice texted to ask if I was safe. A former coworker of Marla's left a voicemail saying she'd heard I was having a hard time coping and wanted to offer support. Someone forwarded me a screenshot from a neighborhood Facebook group where my name appeared in a thread about helping a grieving widow who may not be making sound decisions. The language was careful, gentle, framed as worry. It was also false. I didn't respond to any of it. I saved the screenshots, noted the dates, and added a new line to the timeline. Narrative shift, concern framing. By the end of that week, the story had settled into something specific. I was unstable. Not dangerous, not malicious, just overwhelmed, emotional, incapable of handling complex matters without guidance. It was the kind of characterization that didn't sound cruel unless you listened closely. The kind that made people nod sympathetically instead of asking questions. Marla was very good at that. She called my supervisor again, this time leaving a message about concerns for my well-being. She contacted my aunt, someone I'd never been close to, and suggested I might need help managing finances. She asked if anyone had checked in on me lately. Each move was calculated to look responsible. Each one implied the same thing. I couldn't be trusted. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so familiar. I'd seen versions of this play out on calls, families insisting someone wasn't in their right mind because it made control easier, because it shifted authority away from the person at the center of the crisis. I kept working. I kept documenting. I kept quiet. Then Tyler crossed a line he couldn't walk back. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, when I was between calls and sorting supplies in the back of the rig. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You need to stop this before it gets worse." I didn't reply. A minute later, another message came through. "People are starting to ask questions about you." Still nothing from me. Then the third message arrived, longer this time. "Mom has been patient. She doesn't want to do this, but you're forcing her hand. If you keep pushing, she'll have to protect the family. Think about what that means." I stared at the screen, feeling that familiar cold settle in my chest. Not fear, recognition. I took screenshots and sent them to Detective Alvarez, then added them to the intimidation folder. That evening, I came home to find a manila envelope taped to my door. Inside was a printed copy of the cease and desist letter, this time with handwritten notes in the margins. "We're trying to help you. Please be reasonable. This is not how Ethan would want this handled." I folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table beside the others. At some point, the gaslighting became almost impressive in its consistency. When I refused to engage, Marla escalated outward. She spoke to anyone who would listen, framing herself as the calm center in a situation spiraling out of control. She cried at church. She shook her head sadly when my name came up. She said she was worried about my mental health. And people believed her, not because she was right, but because she was familiar. I found out later that she'd asked a mutual acquaintance for the name of a therapist, not for me, but in case it was needed. The implication was clear: intervention, not conversation. The timing wasn't accidental. 2 days after Tyler's messages, Detective Alvarez called to tell me the prosecutor's office wanted additional corroboration before moving forward. Not because the evidence was weak, but because cases involving family members required extra care. "They're anticipating pushback," he said. "I am too," I replied. The next move came through the mail. A certified letter arrived, addressed to me, informing me that a petition had been filed in county court, requesting a review of my capacity to manage financial affairs. It cited recent erratic behavior and documented concerns from immediate family. Marla had signed it. I sat at the table with the letter in my hands and let myself feel it fully for the first time. The betrayal, the audacity, the sheer confidence it took to attempt something like that. They weren't trying to win an argument anymore. They were trying to disqualify me. I called Detective Alvarez immediately. He listened without interrupting, then asked me to email a copy of the petition. "This actually helps," he said after a moment. "How?" I asked. "It shows intent," he said. "And escalation." I forwarded the document to the insurance fraud team as well. Then I added it to the binder under a new tab: retaliation. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was panicking, but because my mind wouldn't slow down. I replayed conversations, examined timelines, considered outcomes. I thought about how easily they'd pivoted from theft to character assassination, how quickly concern became a weapon. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and walked to the window. The street below was empty. A streetlight flickered, then steadied. I thought about all the moments I'd second-guessed myself over the years. All the times I'd deferred, apologized, softened my words to keep the peace. I wondered how much of that they'd mistaken for permission. By morning, I was done wondering. I contacted an attorney. Her name was Rachel Kim. She specialized in civil fraud and protective orders. When I laid out the facts, she didn't interrupt or raise her eyebrows or tell me it would be complicated. She just nodded and took notes. "This isn't about money anymore," she said when I finished. "This is about control." "I know," I said. She explained the options calmly. Responses to the petition. Protective measures. Next steps if charges were filed. She didn't promise outcomes. She promised preparation. That was enough. Within 24 hours, the tone shifted again. Marla stopped calling. Tyler stopped texting. The Facebook posts disappeared. Concern gave way to silence. It didn't mean they'd stopped. It meant they were recalculating. Rachel filed a response to the petition the same day, attaching evidence I'd already collected: doorbell footage, notary inconsistencies, insurance audit notices, the cease and desist letters, Tyler's messages. When I saw it all assembled in a formal filing, something loosened in my chest. Not relief, recognition. This wasn't me against them anymore. It was them against the record. The next call from Detective Alvarez came late in the afternoon. "The prosecutor wants to meet," he said, "in person." I agreed without hesitation. After we hung up, I sat alone in my apartment, the quiet pressing in around me. I thought about how hard they'd worked to paint me as fragile, as unstable, as someone who needed managing. And I thought about how none of that mattered now, because the truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be complete. Whatever they tried next, whatever story they told, whatever concern they manufactured, it would have to contend with something they couldn't control: evidence. And as I gathered my things and prepared for the meeting that would move this out of the shadows and into the open, I understood something that made me almost laugh. They had spent so much time trying to make me look unfit. They never noticed how fit I'd become to see them clearly. And that, more than anything else, was what would undo them. The meeting with the prosecutor didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a small conference room with beige walls, a scratched table, and a box of tissues pushed slightly out of reach. The kind of room designed to keep emotions contained and conversations factual. Detective Alvarez sat across from me. Rachel was beside me, her legal pad already open. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a precise voice, asked me to start from the beginning. I told the story the same way I always did now, slowly, in order, without commentary. I talked about the courthouse, the blue folder, the insurance change, the missing mail, the credit accounts, the doorbell footage, the notary log, Tyler's messages, the petition questioning my capacity. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react visibly. She just listened and occasionally asked me to clarify a date or confirm a location. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "This is not a misunderstanding," she said. "This is a pattern." She explained what would happen next. Subpoenas, formal interviews, requests for records from the insurance company, the notary office, the banks. She explained the difference between criminal charges and civil remedies, and how cases like this often unfolded in parallel. "We'll need corroboration," she said, "which you already have more of than most people who walk in here." I have say and face. I felt Rachel's shoulder brush mine, a subtle reassurance. Before we left, the prosecutor asked me one final question. "Is there anything else you haven't mentioned that you think matters?" I thought about it for a moment. "There's a child," I said. Everyone looked at me. "Tyler's son," I continued. "He's 7. He spends a lot of time at Marla's house. I don't think he knows what's happening, but he's around it. A lot." The prosecutor nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." On the way home, I felt lighter than I had in months, not because it was over, but because it was no longer private. The story was no longer being whispered or reframed or softened to protect someone's image. It was documented. That night, Rachel emailed me copies of the filings she'd submitted on my behalf. Reading my own life translated into legal language was strange, impersonal, effective. For the first time, I slept through the night. The shift in Marla's behavior was immediate. She stopped reaching out entirely. No voicemails, no texts, no notes taped to my door. Tyler disappeared too, his number finally going silent. Instead, communication came through attorneys. Rachel forwarded me an email from Marla's lawyer proposing a private resolution. It suggested returning certain funds in exchange for my agreement to drop complaints and withdraw cooperation with investigators. Rachel's response was 2 sentences long. My phone rang the next afternoon. "Detective Alvarez. They're interviewing Tyler tomorrow," he said. "And Marla after that." I thanked him and hung up. At work, things stayed normal. Calls came in. We responded. I treated people who had no idea what my life looked like outside the ambulance. I liked that. I liked being competent in a space where no one questioned my sanity or my motives. During a slow moment between calls, I sat on the bumper of the rig and watched kids ride bikes down the street. One of them wobbled, caught himself, and kept going. I thought about Tyler's son and wondered what he'd been told, what he'd overheard. 2 weeks later, the insurance company called with an update. They'd concluded their audit. The beneficiary change was fraudulent. The policy was reinstated in my name. I sat down at the kitchen table and let that sink in. The money itself felt abstract. What mattered was the acknowledgement. A company with no emotional investment had looked at the evidence and reached the same conclusion I had. Right and wrong, in black and white. The credit card companies followed suit one by one. Accounts closed. Balances removed. Letters issued. My credit score began to recover. Slowly but measurably. The petition questioning my capacity was dismissed. Rachel called me as soon as the notice came through. "They didn't even contest it," she said. "They withdrew." I have now. That should have felt like a win. Instead, it felt like the ground shifting again. Because a few days later, Detective Alvarez called with news that changed the shape of everything. Child Protective Services has opened an inquiry, he said. My stomach tightened. Based on what? I asked. Based on information that came up during the interviews, he said. Financial instability, misuse of funds, inconsistent supervision. Education. I pictured Tyler's son, small and quiet, sitting on Marla's couch with his shoes kicked off, cartoons playing in the background while adults talked around him like he wasn't there. What happens now? I asked. They'll assess the situation, he said. Home visits, interviews, temporary arrangements if necessary. That night, I couldn't sit still. I paced my apartment, replaying everything I'd seen over the past months. The way Tyler talked about money, the way Marla framed control as care, the way no one ever asked what the child needed. The next morning, I got a call from a CPS caseworker. She introduced herself, explained the process, and asked if I'd be willing to answer some questions about the family. I answered honestly. Then she asked me something I hadn't expected. If temporary placement becomes necessary, she said, would you be willing to be considered? The question landed heavily in the space between us. I'm not family anymore, I said. You're legally related, she replied. And more importantly, you're a stable adult with a documented history of concern for the child's welfare. I asked for time to think. I drove to the waterfront and sat in my car, staring out at the water. Boats moved slowly across the bay. Seagulls cried overhead. The world looked the same as it always had. Inside me, everything was changing. I thought about the night before Memorial Day, about the documents, about the choices Marla and Tyler had made when they thought no one was watching. I thought about how easy it would be to say no, to draw a clean line and walk away. And I thought about what walking away would mean for a child who had no idea how close he was to being pulled under by someone else's desperation. When I called the caseworker back, my voice was steady. Yes, I said, I would. The paperwork moved quickly after that. Emergency hearings, temporary orders, assessments. Rachel attended with me, quiet and watchful. The judge asked careful questions. The caseworker presented findings. Tyler didn't show up. Marla sat in the back of the room, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. When the judge granted temporary guardianship, I didn't look at her. I looked at the child sitting beside the caseworker, feet dangling above the floor, swinging slightly. He looked scared. I knelt down in front of him and told him my name again, even though he already knew it. I'm not here to take anything away from you, I said softly. I'm just here to make sure you're okay. He nodded, not fully understanding, but trusting the tone. As we walked out of the building together, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me. This wasn't a victory. It was a responsibility. Behind us, doors closed. Papers were filed. Investigations continued. Ahead of us was something entirely different. A future that would require patience, boundaries, and care. A future that didn't look anything like the one Marla had tried to force on me. And as I held the door open and let the child step into the sunlight first, I realized that the story I'd been fighting to tell had changed shape. It was no longer just about what had been taken from me. It was about what I was choosing to protect. And that choice, once made, couldn't be undone. The weeks after the temporary guardianship order blurred together in a way that felt both frantic and strangely quiet. Frantic on paper, court dates, caseworker visits, school forms, medical releases, a bedroom that needed a bed, a desk, a lamp that didn't buzz when it was turned on. Quiet in the spaces between those tasks, when the house settled into a rhythm I hadn't planned for but couldn't ignore. Noah moved through my apartment like someone tiptoeing across thin ice. He asked before opening the fridge. He lined his shoes up perfectly by the door. When he laughed, he covered his mouth with his hand, like he was worried the sound might be too much. The first night, he slept with the light on. I didn't tell him it was okay to turn it off. I just left the door open and sat on the couch until I heard his breathing slow. CPS came twice that first week. The caseworker, a woman named Denise, walked through my apartment with a clipboard and an expression that gave nothing away. She asked about my schedule, my support system, my plans if this arrangement became permanent. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I'm figuring it out. She nodded, wrote something down, and asked Noah if he liked spaghetti. He did. At work, my supervisor adjusted my schedule without making a production of it. A couple of coworkers dropped off hand-me-down books and a backpack they'd been saving for someone else's kid. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. Marla did not call. She sent messages through her attorney instead. Short, polite, cold. Rachel handled them all. She forwarded me the ones that mattered and summarized the rest in a sentence or two. Marla wanted visitation. Tyler wanted assurances. Both wanted control. Neither got it. The criminal case moved forward in parallel. Interviews were conducted. Records were subpoenaed. Tyler's doorbell footage joined mine in the evidence file. The notary's journal entry raised more questions than it answered. Bank logs told a story no one could soften. The prosecutor scheduled a preliminary hearing. I didn't tell Noah where I was going that morning. I told him I had a meeting and that Denise would pick him up for school. He nodded and went back to coloring, careful to keep the crayon inside the lines. The courthouse felt different this time. Not because the building had changed, but because I had. I wore a simple dress and flat shoes. Nothing that asked for sympathy, nothing that looked defensive. Rachel walked beside me, her steps measured, her posture calm. Marla was already there. She sat 2 rows behind the prosecution table, hands folded in her lap, face pale. She looked smaller than I remembered, older. Her eyes flicked toward me when I entered, then away. Tyler arrived late, jaw tight, eyes darting around the room like he was looking for an exit. When the hearing began, the prosecutor laid out the facts. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just one piece after another, arranged in a sequence that left little room for interpretation. The forged signatures, the beneficiary change, the missing mail, the fraudulent accounts, the intimidation attempts, the petition questioning my capacity. Rachel objected once, on a technical point. It was overruled. When it was time for testimony, I took the stand. I answered questions the way I'd learned to clearly, without embellishment. I didn't describe how it felt. I described what happened. When the prosecutor asked about the voicemail, she played it for the room. Ethan's voice filled the space, thin and rushed, but unmistakable. "If anything ever happens," he said, "don't let Mom handle the insurance. Promise me." Marla closed her eyes. Tyler stared straight ahead. The judge listened, asked a few clarifying questions, then announced that there was sufficient cause to proceed. Dates were set, motions filed. The machinery of accountability began to turn. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Someone called my name. Someone else asked how it felt to win. I didn't stop walking. Back home, Noah met me at the door, holding up a paper he'd drawn at school. It was a stick figure house with 2 people inside and a dog we didn't own. "That's us," he said, pointing. I swallowed and taped it to the fridge. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone at the table and stared at the empty chair across from me. The chair Ethan used to sit in, the chair Tyler had taken without asking, the chair that had been at the center of so many quiet power shifts I hadn't noticed until it was too late. I thought about Marla sitting in that courtroom, watching a story she'd controlled for years finally slip out of her hands. I thought about Tyler, realizing too late that charm and pressure didn't work when there was a record. And I thought about the choice I'd made when Denise asked if I would be willing. No one had forced me into this. No one had guilted me. I could have said no and walked away clean. Instead, I had stepped into something heavier. A few days later, Marla requested a meeting. Through attorneys, through caseworkers, through enough layers to keep it from becoming a confrontation. She wanted to see Noah. The request sat on my kitchen table for a long time. Rachel laid out the options: supervised visitation, conditions, boundaries, risks. I thought about Noah's careful shoes, his covered laughter, the way he flinched when voices rose too quickly. "I'll agree," I said finally, "but not for her." Rachel looked at me. "For him," I said. The visit happened in a neutral room with a caseworker present. Toys lined the shelves. A clock ticked loudly on the wall. Marla walked in slowly, as if the floor might give way beneath her. She knelt in front of Noah and reached for his hands. "My sweet boy," she said, voice trembling. Noah looked at her, then back at me. He let her hug him. I stood against the wall, arms crossed, watching every movement, watching how she spoke to him, how she tried to frame herself as the injured party, how she avoided looking at me. When it was over, Noah took my hand without being asked. In the car afterward, he was quiet. She was crying, he said. I know, I replied. Is that because of me? He asked. No, I said firmly. It's not because of you. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't just about justice. It was about interruption. Interrupting a pattern before it finished replicating itself. Interrupting a story before it became someone else's burden to carry. The criminal case would take months, maybe longer. Outcomes were never guaranteed. Rachel made sure I understood that, but the shape of my life had already changed in ways no verdict could undo. I was no longer fighting to be believed. I was building something that didn't require belief at all. One evening, as I tucked Noah into bed, he asked me a question I hadn't prepared for. Are you going to leave me too? He asked, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I sat down on the edge of the bed and chose my words carefully. I don't know what the future looks like, I said, but I'm not planning on going anywhere. He considered that, then nodded. Okay, he said. When I turned off the light and closed the door, I leaned my forehead against the frame and let myself breathe. There would be consequences. There would be fallout. There would be days when this choice felt unbearably heavy. But there would also be mornings like this one, quiet, ordinary, anchored in something real. And as I walked back into the living room, past the binder of evidence and the stack of legal papers, I realized that whatever Marla and Tyler lost in the months ahead, it wouldn't compare to what they'd already forfeited. The chance to decide who I was. The chance to decide what mattered. And the chance to decide what kind of ending this story would have. Because the last chapter, I knew now, wouldn't be written in a courtroom. It would be written in the small, daily choices that followed, the ones no one else was watching. The ending didn't arrive with a verdict. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when Noah missed the bus and spilled orange juice on the kitchen counter while apologizing too many times for something that didn't matter. It arrived while I wiped the counter, handed him a clean shirt, and realized my heartbeat had finally slowed to a pace that felt livable. By then, the case had taken on a life of its own. Motions were filed, deadlines were set, Tyler's attorney negotiated, Marla's attorney recalibrated. Words like continuance and discovery became part of my weekly vocabulary. I showed up when I needed to, answered what I was asked, and went back to living. That was the difference. Before, everything had felt suspended, like my life was on hold until someone else decided how it should end. Now, the legal process ran in the background, and my days ran in the foreground. Noah started sleeping with the light off. He stopped lining his shoes so precisely. He laughed louder. He asked for pancakes on Saturdays and complained about homework on Sundays. He learned which cabinet held the snacks and stopped asking permission to open the fridge. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that don't look like justice but feel like it. Marla's visits continued under supervision for a while, then became less frequent. She grew quieter during them, less performative. She talked about memories instead of grievances. She asked Noah about school, and listened to the answers without redirecting them back to herself. I watched closely. I always would. Tyler's situation deteriorated more publicly. Missed hearings, missed payments, a plea agreement that reduced exposure but didn't erase accountability. He stopped trying to contact me directly once his attorney made it clear that every attempt only made things worse. The day the insurance company issued a formal apology, I folded the letter and placed it in the binder without ceremony. The money was restored. The accounts were closed. My credit stabilized. On paper, everything balanced out. Emotionally, it never would. And that was okay. I didn't need closure in the way people like to imagine it. I didn't need Marla to admit what she'd done, or Tyler to explain why. I didn't need a moment where everyone finally understood how wrong they'd been. What I needed had already happened. I had stopped asking for permission to exist in my own life. The final court hearing came and went on a rainy afternoon. I sat in the same beige room as before, listened to arguments that felt strangely distant now, and watched as the judge summarized months of evidence into a handful of sentences. Findings were made, orders were issued, consequences attached themselves to actions with a clarity that felt almost impersonal. When it was over, Rachel shook my hand and said, "You handled this with restraint." I nodded, because that was true. But restraint wasn't what had changed me. Responsibility was. The guardianship review happened a few weeks later. Denise visited the apartment again, asked Noah how he felt, observed us moving through a routine that no longer felt staged. Her report was brief, stable, appropriate, in the child's best interest. The judge made the temporary arrangement permanent, with conditions that protected Noah without isolating him from his history. It wasn't a clean break. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than both. When we left the courthouse that day, Noah asked if we could get ice cream. We did. We sat on a bench by the water, cones melting faster than we could keep up, and watched boats move slowly across the bay. The sky was clear. The air smelled like salt and sunscreen. Noah kicked his legs against the bench. "Are we a family now?" he asked, casually, like he was asking what time dinner would be. I took a breath. "Yes," I said. "We are." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his ice cream. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of all this. Exhausted, grieving, willing to sign papers just to keep things moving, willing to believe that help always came without a price. I didn't blame her anymore. She did the best she could with what she had. I also thought about Marla, sitting in the back of that courtroom months ago, watching control slip away, about the way she'd tried to protect an image at the expense of a person, about how quickly care turned into coercion when it stopped working. I didn't feel triumph. I felt distance. And distance, I was learning, was its own kind of peace. The story people told about me never really corrected itself. Some still thought I'd overreacted. Some still believed Marla's version of events. Some avoided the subject altogether. I stopped caring. Truth doesn't need unanimous agreement. It needs integrity. At night, after Noah went to bed, I sometimes sat at the kitchen table with the binder open, flipping through the tabs. Insurance. Credit. Evidence. Court. It felt strange, holding proof of something that no longer defined my daily life. One evening, I closed the binder and slid it onto the shelf, behind cookbooks and school papers and a stack of drawings Noah insisted on keeping. It didn't need to be within reach anymore. The real ending wasn't about exposure or apology or punishment. It was about interruption. A cycle that had been quietly passed down, justified, normalized, disguised as love and concern, had stopped with me. Not because I was stronger or smarter than anyone else, but because I chose not to hand it off to the next person. I chose to absorb the weight instead. That choice cost me relationships I once thought were permanent. It cost me comfort. It cost me the illusion that family always means safety. But it gave me something I hadn't expected. A future that wasn't built on fear. On the anniversary of Ethan's death, Noah and I went for a walk by the water. We didn't make a speech out of it. We didn't turn it into a lesson. We just stood there for a while, watching the tide come in. "I don't remember him very well," Noah said quietly. "That's okay," I replied. "You don't have to." He thought about that, then reached for my hand. I held it. The price of trusting the wrong family had been high, higher than I ever would have chosen. But the cost of walking away, of letting the cycle continue, would have been higher still. Everything I thought I knew about loyalty, about care, about what it meant to do the right thing, had been tested and reshaped. And what remained, when all of it settled, was simple. I didn't win. I protected. I didn't expose. I interrupted. And in doing so, I built a life that didn't need to be defended, explained, or proven. Just lived.